The first act, the exposition, was destined to begin not with a triumph of engineering, but with a silent rain of dead flesh. On that stifling summer day of 1851, the very cream of London society gathered beneath the majestic, transparent vaults of the Crystal Palace. Light refracted through thousands of glass panes, creating the illusion of a divine glow, but the air inside resembled a scorching furnace. Suddenly, the music died as a dead tropical parrot plummeted from the unattainable height of the cast-iron girders onto the silk bonnet of a noble lady. Its bright plumage was singed by the suffocating heat that had accumulated under the ceiling of this man-made greenhouse. Before the crowd could even cry out, a literal downpour of lifeless exotic birds began, smashing against the flawless parquet floor, staining expensive dresses and the impeccable tailcoats of gentlemen with blood. The Victorian Utopia, designed to demonstrate the greatness of the human mind, turned from its very first day into a luxuriously decorated tomb for all living things. The fall of the feathered messengers of death did not halt the festivities, it merely exposed the deep, chilling indifference of the complacent upper class. The exhibition organizers rushed to declare the incident an unfortunate accident caused by the poor adaptation of colonial fauna. Dozens of servants in starched liveries rushed to collect the bloody carcasses, trying not to attract undue attention from the honorable public. However, the smell of decay and singed feathers had already mingled with the scents of expensive French perfumes. Visitors continued to stroll solemnly between the endless rows of machinery and jewels, pretending that nothing had happened. Beneath the crystal sky of London, pride confidently triumphed over common sense, turning the suffocating pavilion into an altar of worship for their own infallibility. The iron structures, designed with unprecedented scale, mercilessly accumulated the ruthless July sun. The water in the decorative fountains began to boil, and rare ferns, brought from the most hidden corners of the planet, blackened and curled into dry tubes within a matter of hours. Gentlemen discreetly loosened their cravats, and ladies increasingly resorted to smelling salts, losing consciousness right in the middle of the shining halls. The palace breathed a heavy, stale heat, like a living organism trapped in its own shell. Yet the press continued to churn out laudatory odes, calling this structure the eighth wonder of the world and the greatest achievement of the era. No one wanted to admit that behind the brilliant facade of the industrial paradise lay an ugly, stifling trap for anyone who crossed its threshold. The most perceptive of the guests noticed dirty drops of thick condensation trickling down the inside of the glass walls. This salty human sweat, evaporating from thousands of bodies, returned as a sticky morning dew. Under the dome of this man-made ecosystem, its own perverted laws of nature began to operate. Pavilion caretakers whispered among themselves about strange rustlings and dull thuds coming from beneath the massive wooden flooring at night. There, in the deep shadow of the foundation, lay hidden what the respectable citizens of the empire preferred not to think about. The true price of this crystal magnificence had already begun to sprout through the cracks of the perfect parquet, poisoning the air with the premonition of an impending and inevitable catastrophe. The designer of this glass wonder, Joseph Paxton, tied the knot of the plot's inception, ignoring the ominous omen. The palace continued to welcome millions of enthusiastic visitors who blindly admired the scale of industrial progress. Inside this gigantic greenhouse, the air temperature rose daily to unbearable heights, turning the strolls of aristocrats into a sophisticated torture. People fanned themselves, fainted from heatstrokes, and suffocated in their multi-layered woolen suits and corsets, yet stubbornly continued to glorify British genius. Pride made them look away as behind the transparent walls, as if in admonition, the rarest plants from all over the world withered, and employees secretly carried out dozens of new feathered victims every morning. The Crystal Palace became a monument to human stubbornness, locked in a cage of glass and iron, where civilization had declared war on nature itself. Every morning began with a silent ritual of cleansing, hidden from the eyes of the respectable public. Before the first rays of the sun turned the galleries into a scorching furnace, battalions of nameless sweepers scraped soot from the showcases and collected the corpses of those who had not survived the stifling night. It was not only birds that fell victim to this man-made anomaly. Rare butterflies, brought from the Amazon jungle, burned alive the moment they touched the glass frames that were scalding from the inside. However, Paxton and the members of the Royal Commission remained blind to the suffering of the living world. For them, the palace remained a flawless mathematical equation embodied in cast iron. Engineering reports were filled with dry numbers praising the structural strength, while the very atmosphere inside the building grew increasingly toxic and hostile to all that breathed. Public opinion, driven by enthusiastic newspaper articles, created an aura of sacred pilgrimage around the exhibition. The internal heat, which melted the wax on the ceremonial candles, was interpreted as an inevitable price for contemplating the greatness of human thought. The silk top hats of gentlemen became covered in beads of sweat, and the heavy velvet skirts of ladies turned into unliftable shackles. People moved through the halls slowly, as if in a dream, intoxicated by the smell of overheated machine oil and wilting orchids. It was a collective madness, dictated by a fierce faith in their own superiority over the elements. The British Empire wished to see its reflection in the clean glass, failing to notice that this mirror was gradually turning into the warped wall of a ruthless and bleak sepulchre. Behind the facade of universal jubilation, critics tried timidly to point out the structural flaws in ventilation, but their voices drowned in the roar of operating machinery. Paxton stubbornly refused to admit that his creation violated the basic laws of coexistence with the environment. The closed ecosystem of the palace avenged itself upon its creators every single minute. The air, deprived of natural movement, stagnated, creating invisible pockets of suffocating gas beneath the highest vaults. The architect believed he was controlling light and space, but in reality, he had merely built the perfect scenery for a grandiose act of human hubris. And while millions of feet continued to tramp upon the flawless wooden floors, the invisible counter of catastrophe had already begun its inexorable and terrifying countdown. The beginning of the second act moved the structure to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the palace was relocated to the south of London, and the development of the crisis reached its apogee. The space, conceived as a symbol of eternal triumph, began to slowly rot from within, turning into a ghostly monument of a bygone era. The structure required colossal efforts to sustain life, yet the glass grew dull with soot, and the cast iron beams were unnoticeably undermined by rust. People continued to come here like moths to a fading light, unaware that this place was accumulating not only solar energy but also the hidden fury of a suppressed element. Attempts to rebuild and revive the halls only plunged the colossus deeper into the abyss of doom, making it resemble a gigantic prehistoric Leviathan washed ashore. The new home on Sydenham Hill was supposed to give the glass giant a second birth, but it brought only a prolonged withering. Time mercilessly washed the gilding off imperial ambitions, leaving behind a grey film of London smog. The palace spread its transparent wings among the hills like an alien ship shipwrecked in the English countryside. Torrents of rainwater seeped through the dried-out seals for years, leaving indelible marks of corrosion on the metal supports. Every drop falling from the dome brought the inevitable end closer, destroying the myth of the permanence of Victorian engineering. Grandeur gave way to decadence, and the idle crowd was replaced by melancholic onlookers searching for shards of a lost paradise among the tarnished showcases. The administration desperately tried to restore the building's former commercial appeal, turning its halls into a venue for the most diverse spectacles. They staged grand music festivals, dog shows, and even cat shows here, but the stifling ghost of the past still lingered beneath the vaults. The sounds of the gigantic organ shook the decaying floors, causing the glass sheets to vibrate faintly and plaintively. This vibration seemed like the silent groan of a trapped beast whose patience was running out. The air inside the pavilions grew heavier, absorbing the scents of hundreds of thousands of human bodies and cheap entertainments. The industrial Utopia had completely degenerated into a cumbersome sideshow, retaining only the outer contours of its former majesty. Nature, once banished and trampled by the exhibition's creators, began to slowly reclaim its rights over these cast-iron acres. Wild ivy climbed stubbornly up the outer walls, entwining the metal framework and sprouting through the smallest cracks into the halls. A new generation of birds, born in the wild, no longer fell dead but circled predatory above the glass roof, as if scouting for their future prey. The palace no longer belonged to the mock triumphants of the Industrial Revolution, it had become a hostage to its own isolation. The internal crisis of the structure deepened with every winter frost and every summer heat, accumulating destructive energy. The colossus stood on top of the hill, silently waiting for the hour when the accumulated anger of the elements would break free. The point of no return and the culmination of the second act arrived in late November of 1936, when a true catastrophe was conceived behind the locked doors of the Crystal Palace. A small outbreak of fire in the central gallery turned the glass Utopia into a roaring inferno within minutes. The wind rushed beneath the dome, fanning the flames to the heavens, and the Crystal Palace flared up like a gigantic matchbox, illuminating nocturnal London with an ominous crimson glow. Glass panels burst with a deafening crackle resembling a continuous cannonade, sending millions of red-hot shards into the air. Thousands of citizens watched from the hills with horror and awe as the symbol of their former greatness crumbled, transforming into a blazing skeleton of cast iron. The attempts of a few night watchmen to cope with the initial blaze proved pathetic and futile in the face of the awakened element. The wooden floorboards, which for long decades had absorbed machine oil, varnishes, and flammable cleaning agents, caught fire instantly as if they were woven from dry gunpowder. The fire raced rapidly upward along the decorative elements, capturing new spaces with a frightening, unnatural speed. Within the colossal greenhouse, a powerful draft was created, turning the building into a cyclopean furnace roaring with its own fury. The thirst for destruction that had accumulated beneath the transparent vaults for many years finally broke free, sweeping away any obstacles in its path and leaving humanity not a single chance to rectify the engineering mistakes committed. The fire tornado born inside the structure made the entire surrounding area shudder within a radius of several miles. Fire brigades arriving at the scene of the disaster from all over London faced an unprecedented force against which water cannons seemed like children's toys. The intense heat did not allow the rescuers to approach the walls of the building closer than 100 meters, charring their clothes and causing the paint on the fire engines to ignominiously blister and peel away. The crystal dome, which had once reflected the greatness of the empire, now spewed sheaves of toxic sparks and plumes of suffocating black smoke into the night sky. The air around Sydenham Hill grew hot to such an extent that the grass and nearby trees on the hill began to smolder on their own, doubling the scale of the ongoing nightmare. The shattered glass ceilings opened the fire's free access to oxygen, and the flames leapt hundreds of feet upward, painting the clouds above the capital in an unnatural bloody color. This monstrous torch was visible from the most remote quarters of the city, causing people to wake up in panic and run out into the streets in nothing but their nightgowns. The pride that had built this palace was now burning before the eyes of an astonished nation, vividly demonstrating the fragility of human ambitions before the fundamental forces of nature. Inside this blazing hell, entire halls collapsed, burying the remnants of former triumphs beneath tons of debris and turning the once great creation of Joseph Paxton into a shapeless, white-hot mass. The third act and the precipitous fall caused the catastrophe to overstep the boundaries of the building itself. The immense temperature inside the burning palace melted tons of lead that had been used to bind the glass frames and seal the vast roof. Bubbling torrents of liquid, incandescent metal poured downward, crashing through the remnants of the ceilings and spilling out onto the adjacent city streets. Fiery rivers of lead flooded the pavements, destroying everything in their path and turning the nightly alleyways into a futuristic hell. Firefighters were powerless before this boiling mass, which fused immovably into the cobblestones, erasing the boundaries between the triumph of human thought and primordial chaos. This silvery white current, glowing in the darkness with an otherworldly radiance, moved at a speed that left no chance for salvation. The scalding lead consumed manicured Victorian lawns with a hiss, turning decorative shrubs and garden benches into charred embers in fractions of a second. Plumes of toxic, heavy vapors rose from the boiling streams, suffocating the few brave souls who attempted to maintain the cordon around the dying giant. The surrounding landscape was changing beyond recognition, as if under the influence of some unknown tectonic shift. The monumental luxury of past decades dissolved before everyone's eyes into this liquid metallic mass, exposing the true vulnerability of the man-made world in the face of an awakened industrial monster. The city utilities, laid underground with such pride and meticulousness, began to collapse one after another under the weight of the burning lead carapace. Telephone cables melted, depriving rescuers of communication, while water pipes burst from the monstrous temperature differential, throwing geysers of dirty steam into the air. Torrents of the melt flowed into storm drains, solidifying there into dead plugs and turning London's underground system into a sealed labyrinth. Residents of nearby houses abandoned their homes in panic, leaving their belongings behind, as the liquid metal was already approaching the thresholds of their doors. Panic gripped Sydenham Hill as people realized that the great achievement of their ancestors was capable of physically destroying every living thing in the vicinity. It seemed that the earth itself could not withstand the weight of this baptism of fire, sagging and cracking under the pressure of the incandescent lava of technogenic origin. The metal seeped into cellars, igniting stored provisions and turning the basement floors of surrounding buildings into isolated branches of the underworld. The majestic Victorian facades, reflecting the crimson glints of the fire, looked like pathetic props in a theater of total destruction. In this pre-dawn hour, the Crystal Palace finally ceased to be merely an architectural object. It transformed into a punishing instrument, mercilessly mauling the very urban environment it had once been destined to adorn and exalt in the eyes of an astonished humanity. The finale of this tragedy exposed the true, terrifying essence of what had occurred, leaving behind nothing but ash and an unpredictable realization of horror. When the flames subsided the following morning, the eyes of the survivors were met with a gruesome wasteland covered in solidified gray waves of lead. Clearing the smoking rubble in search of salvaged valuables, rescue workers stumbled upon the central underground gallery, which had been sealed fast by the metal that had poured from above. Through a thick crust of the solidified, ice-clear alloy of lead and glass, as if in the display case of a nightmarish museum, they beheld hundreds of perfectly preserved human bodies. These were not Victorian workers killed in the fire, but vagrants and the destitute buried alive by the palace's first builders, whose disappearances had been covered up to protect the exhibition's reputation. From the very beginning, the Crystal Palace had been not an exhibition of achievements, but a colossal crypt that Victorian pride had built upon the bones of its most destitute citizens, keeping their faces intact for posterity in this eternal leaden grave. A gruesome silence fell over Sydenham Hill as the first rays of the morning sun illuminated the scale of the uncovered truth. The rescue workers, frozen at the edge of the chasm, could not utter a single word while staring at this silent host embalmed in metal. Through the thickness of the glossy, solidified alloy emerged the faces of men, women, and children contorted in deathly agony, whose rags contrasted sharply with the luxury that had once reigned above them. The fire and the lead stripped the mask of prosperity from the great era, exposing its filthiest and most closely guarded secret. Those whom London society of 1851 had erased from its official history had now returned from oblivion like mute accusers demanding a century-old justice. The excavation management immediately attempted to cordon off the area and classify the horrific find, but rumors of the underground crypt spread through the waking capital with the speed of the wind. Citizens who just yesterday had wept for the loss of national pride now realized with a shudder the kind of foundation upon which their imperial arrogance had rested. The archives of Victorian-era construction companies, hastily retrieved by a government commission, confirmed the terrible suspicion of mass burials within the base of the foundation. In order to meet the opening deadline of the Great Exhibition and avoid overshadowing the arrival of foreign delegations, human lives had been mercilessly immured in concrete and cast iron, becoming wordless building material for the impending triumph. The faces of the wretched, preserved by the leaden shell, retained the pristine expression of horror captured 85 years before this fateful day. No decay had touched their features beneath the airtight shroud, making the underground gallery an eternal reminder of the price of unbridled progress. The great wonder of glass and iron, which had blinded millions of people with its purity and light, proved to be merely a tombstone concealing the ugly underbelly of a capitalist utopia. And while the last drops of molten metal were cooling down, a heavy, crushing realization hung over London that the Crystal Palace had burned not from an accidental spark, but from an accumulated, century-old curse that had finally broken free.